Dr. Jameton did remind me that he's a PhD type doctor, not a medical doctor. So he has suggested that when we enter the question and answer period, if anybody has additional medical, if anybody raises a question that's specifically medical and we need additional medical information, then if we have CSR doctors and other health professionals who might be on the call, they should feel free to chime in and help us answer any questions. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Andrew Jameton. Andy?
Thank you, Barb. I'm glad to be presenting this seminar. Actually, working on the health effects of climate change is really one of my favorite subjects. The changes that are happening in the world are so very interesting these days, and much needs to be learned about these effects, and at the same time they're very, very challenging. So they make something interesting for a philosopher in the sense that we have a lot we need to think about, and we need to integrate a lot of different kinds of information. In starting this seminar, we're going to do a little pre-quiz just to get our brain cells working on the topic. These are not meant to be hard questions. There's just simply basic information that we're going to be covering in the discussion and more. First question is, prior to Hurricane Katrina, sorry, I'm fiddling a bit with the controls here before I really get this down. Okay, prior to Hurricane Katrina, what was the deadliest type of extreme weather event to strike the U.S.? Tornadoes, floods, or heat? If you have a hard time with this question, you're not used to multiple choice questions. The urban heat island phenomenon causes warmer temperatures in cities during both the daytime and the nighttime. Is this true or false? Question 3. The European heat wave in 2003 caused how many deaths overall? This is an estimate based on deaths before and after the heat wave itself, and somewhere between 700 deaths and 700,000. According to the IPCC, heat waves are expected to increase in frequency, magnitude, duration, some or all of the above. And we'll talk about the IPCC later. Describe 3 consequences of heat stroke. When high heat threatens, what anticipatory guidance can health practitioners give to patients and their families to help them stay safe? Give several examples. Okay, that was our 6 starter questions. Let's talk a little bit first about why climate change and concerns about heat are connected, or how they're connected. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was created by the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environmental Division to follow up on the growing evidence that climate change was expected as a result of anthropogenic causes, largely release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And they have been scheduled to make several reports. They probably were first completely definite on the issue in 2001 in their 3rd assessment report. And the current quote here on your screen is from a special report on cold days and nights. And the IPCC is virtually certain, which is about as high as a percentage you're going to get from scientists, that by the end of the century the Earth will experience a decrease in frequency and magnitude of cold days and nights and an increase in frequency and magnitude of unusually warm days and nights. By the way, the IPCC is scheduled quite soon to issue its next report. It will be its 5th major report, the first part of which is coming out, I think, in September if it comes out in time, and then they'll follow through over several months with the rest of the report. That will be the scientific basis. They also report on what the consequences will be, and then they report on what might be done by way of coping in terms of mitigation and adaptation. The next slide is a brief sketch, and about as quick a sketch as you can get, of how the IPCC is currently seeing what we're likely to or might see by way of temperature changes. So along the bottom of the slide, you'll see years in 100-year intervals, starting about 100 years ago, about now, then 100 years from now, where most of the projections stop, and then on into the future. And I want you to notice a few things about this slide. There's a low projection, and they might call it a scenario, in which we just stop putting carbon out in the atmosphere. We take Bill McKibben's and Jim Hansen's advice, and we just close down carbon dioxide emissions as fast as we can. We're still committed to some degree of temperature rise. Estimates of what we've seen so far vary depending on when we take as a starting date, but it's on the order of 0.7 or 8 degrees centigrade since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, with most of that in the last 50 years, and most of that 50-year rise in the last 30 years, and so on. And we're committed to around 0.7 more degrees with the Earth catching up in the momentum of warming before it equilibrates by the end of the century. Notice also the top line, the red one, and by the way, the little soft light things around the lines are 1 degree standard deviation in the estimates. The steep one is basically what happens if we don't manage it, and we continue what they call the business as usual scenario, in which we continue with economic growth with the same proportion roughly of carbon dioxide emissions and energy use to that growth. Now in between are scenarios which involve some degree of mitigation and management. Each more, the green one and the blue one, more rapid and more extreme than the other. What you should notice about these, though, is that these continue well into the future. So many of the scientists who are concerned about climate change are not only concerned about what might be happening in the next decade and up to 2050 and then to 2100, but what might be happening on Earth with humans and other animals over thousands of years. And the carbon dioxide that we're putting in the atmosphere now has a very long tail running up to 10,000 years or so. And notice that after 2100, where the conversation usually stops, we're still increasing in temperature, even with some of the more optimistic scenarios. Notice also there's a 2-degree line. If you look on the left y-axis there, 2 degrees centigrade up, has been labeled by many as kind of the key threshold of severe problems, although actually there's no, it's like human balding. No point where you've gone from having hair to being bald. There's no particular threshold that's sharp, but as the temperatures go up, problems increase. But they become increasingly unmanageable. So that we're working on something here which inevitably needs mitigation, or else anything that we're talking about today around adaptation, which is most of the conversation, will eventually become futile. And that's why so many people are worried. Now there are many dimensions of weather-related and heat-related aspects of climate change, and many of them, and in fact most of them, are destructive or negative. This pastiche slide here is meant to indicate some of these things. High winds and storms, also related to water. It's carbon dioxide and water in the atmosphere that drives the energy that causes these things. Forest fires, which have huge pollution dimensions. There's hurricanes. That's the whorl at the top. Although I can't tell which hurricane it is. Below, I think we have a sunset or sunrise and a polluted day, if I'm guessing right. And then we have forests down after it looks like fire, and so on. So, but it's heat, by and large, that people worry about the most. And why do they worry about it the most? Well, in the U.S. at least, and I think generally in the world, it is the direct high temperatures combined with humidity cause most of the serious illness, emergency room trips, hospital admissions, negative health events, and deaths related to climate change. Also, it's the most direct, and so it's in some ways the one we're best able to measure and to have expectations about. Now, a lot of this discussion is about heat in urban areas, which I think is appropriate for the U.S., where something like 80% of people live in cities. And we have here with the heat island effect, which some of you may remember the denialists tried to exploit to show that actually what we were measuring was not global average temperature increase, but merely a heat island effect. Well, there is a heat island effect, and when you take it out of the figures and statistics for the climate change scenarios and do a reanalysis with only rural areas, you still get basically the same results. Now, the more urban and crowded, built up, commercial, and so on, the more you get a heat island effect, which may raise temperatures up to anywhere from 2 to up to around 10 degrees Fahrenheit above the temperatures in a rural area. And these increases usually will happen in both night and the day. Interestingly, they also happen in suburban areas, and cities that have sprawled and now have large suburban areas often are hotter than those that have stayed more compact. And this is partly because the rate of transportation and amount of transportation that's going on in the city is much higher for these kinds of areas. Omaha, where I'm speaking from right now, is actually one of those kinds of sprawled cities that has been getting perceptibly warmer over the years. And in fact, we have a great day today to talk about it, because it's been really tropical here with early morning rains, humid and hot in the 90s. What makes the heat island effect is all that concrete, which is massy and absorbs a lot of heat, releases at night. Taller buildings inhibit the winds, so the convection currents are less. There's usually fewer plants and trees, which by respiring are cooler and cool rural areas, but they don't so much in urban areas. And the heavy concrete areas are often dark or asphalt, which absorb a lot of heat. Also, they're non-porous, so there's no real release of ground moisture that help cool things off. So let's talk a bit about what happens with human health, and we're going to get pretty directly medical here. And there's a range of effects that might be called collectively heat illness or heat-related illness. And there are heat problems not mentioned here that are prequels to what we're going to talk about on the slides, where simply hot weather often makes it difficult for people to engage in exertional activities. And these apply particularly to people who work outside and don't have air conditioning available, who work on roads and building houses and such. Also, agriculturalists who are doing traditional agriculture, which is a vast majority of farmers in the world, who lack air-conditioned harvesters and such to drive around in. And even in those farms, a lot of physical work has to be done outside. And then the third area, which is I think quite important for youth, is sports, and those who exercise throughout life. Sports coaches and so on who have outside activities need to be thinking more about what kind of activities they have for their students and teams outside in the heat. So you start to see problems around this with heat cramps, where a salt imbalance leads to muscle pains or spasms that often come well after the exercise period, like in the evening when you're resting. And they'll be in the abdomen, arms, or legs, and they are related to strenuous activity. What you want your patient to do, or your teammates, is to stop everything, go sit in a cool place, which hopefully you can find. And you want to drink a clear juice or a sports beverage or water, and you should stay out of further strenuous activity after the cramps subside, because exertion may lead to worse problems. And you'll want to consult the doctor if these kind of things don't go away right away. At a more extreme level, you get effects that are in some ways shocky. Part of what's going on is to cope with high temperatures, mammals and humans in particular sweat, so they get the cooling effect from the sweating. They also have the skin circulation expands, and this puts an increasing, in order to shed heat faster, and this puts an increasing weight on the cardiovascular system to pump this larger volume of blood. So we're beginning to get marginal in terms of the body's capacity to cope, and the body's temperature is beginning to rise at its central temperature. The skin is often moist or cool in these circumstances, but the inner temperature is not, it's feverish but not very high. And people will feel very thirsty, they might be sweating heavily, they'll seem weak and pale, have headaches, nausea, vomiting, dizziness, fainting, or fatigue. And actually I think I remember being in that state in a visit to Niger in West Africa to see my daughter there some years ago, where it could be very, very hot. If you continue to heat up, these systems fail and the body can no longer control its heat. You may get very high temperatures, 105 degrees up, and you have everything that you need to deal with that you might have from a fever, plus the failure of the temperature control systems of the body. Now the skin's also hot and dry, and the patient may be delirious, have convulsions, go in a coma, and possibly die. And given the death rate from extreme heat that we see in cities, we know that this can very readily happen. One story, unfortunate one, is of the July Chicago heat wave in 1995, where about 750 people died from heat-related illness. Now, a lot of things were going on in this. It was the extreme heat. It was also quite humid, and the humidity and the heat tend to combine to create a heat index that is particularly dangerous. Most of the people who died in Chicago during this period were in poorer areas of the city where people often lacked air conditioning or in housing that was badly designed or badly maintained. They were often elderly or isolated and either unable or unwilling to leave their apartments. There were a number of electrical failures during that period, and the emergency room rates went up very, very high. In fact, they were more or less flooded. The city had a system of warning and cooling centers and the various things planned for a heat emergency, but the warning wasn't issued until around the 5th day of the 6-day heat wave. Also, you may remember way back in the old days, if you're as old as I am, and we did this in our family, people used to go out on the fire escapes or into the park to sleep at night. But people feel too endangered these days to feel comfortable with these kinds of solutions to extreme heat. So feeling unsafe, many people stayed inside. Now, air conditioning, of course, is a great solution to this. And say around 1970 or so, perhaps half of the U.S. was air conditioned. And now only maybe 15% of residences are no longer air conditioned in the U.S. So we don't see the death rates from high heat in the U.S. that we see in parts of the world that are not yet as developed. On the other hand, air conditioning is very costly in terms of fossil fuel use if it's using electricity as it is usually generated by fossil fuels. So in some ways, what we're getting by using air conditioning to solve these problems is a feedback cycle, a positive feedback cycle, in which by coping or adapting with climate change, we're actually also aggravating it. Also, air conditioning in the cities dumps heat out into the streets and also aggravates the heat island effect in the city for people who are outside or have to be outside. And of course, the air pollution related to these things also aggravates such conditions as angina, asthma, allergies, and so on, which combine with heat problems to cause increased death rates. Probably the major pollution issue with regard to heat in the cities, although there are many. In fact, excuse me, I was going to distract you with a piece of prose that's not handy here. Ground level ozone is a problem. Ozone combines with the water in the mucosa to create acid. And if you breathe enough of it or long enough, it can go deep into the airway and do lung damage. But it can be irritating even just at the orifices and are part way down the bronchia. That's actually one reason one shouldn't be drinking alcohol as a way of coping with heat, because alcohol tends to put the cilia in the bronchia to sleep, more or less, so that pollution gets down into the lungs more easily than it does otherwise. And there's studies that show, for example, if you smoke and drink, you have a bigger problem when you drink more and smoke than when you smoke more and drink. So ground level ozone is a problem, and of course it reacts chemically with other things. It's partly the result of the use of hydrocarbons, largely for fuel, nitrogen in the atmosphere, and sunlight, and smog is often the form of this which you see, and of course it's ozone and other pollutants. There are cardiovascular issues, as I suggested, is that body's pumping more blood into the skin that the heart is having to handle more volume, and so there's increased incidence of stroke, cardiovascular hospitalizations, heart attacks, and so on, angina as the temperature increases. And then the ozone can increase this effect and increase the heart arrhythmia risk. The stunning heat wave that was most disturbing in recent years was the 2003 European heat wave, where, as a rough estimate, I think, and counting deaths is one of these difficult things. And those writing about this, by the way, are wishing that we had figures more in terms of dailies and qualities and years of life lost and so on. But that kind of information hasn't been refined yet, and it's actually a research area that would be very useful. There was also some worry as to whether these deaths were deaths that were brought about only somewhat sooner by way of, it's sometimes called harvesting, where someone was about to die soon, died during the heat effect. And people have looked at that, and very few of these deaths, perhaps 1 out of 5 or less, were related to this form of harvesting. And very much as in the Chicago area, the elderly were an important group of vulnerable people, but so were chronically ill people, and young children. Under 5 is usually given as the age under which you'd anticipate problems. And by the way, not in the slideshow, but it's interesting that some people are reporting that prematurity of birth is related to temperature, and so that might be something to watch out for as well. Europe is normally fairly cool and actually consumes on the order of half the energy that the U.S. does per capita, and the lack of air conditioning here proved to be an unexpected important problem. Here's a nice way of putting the problem for Europe by Dr. Peter Scott. If greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase, which is likely, by the 2040s, more than half of European summers will be hotter than the summer of 2003. And by the end of the century, a summer as hot as that of 2003 will be considered unusually cool. Now, later in the century, there will be more people globally, and by most predictions, more older people, unless all these heat events reduce the rate of us getting older, so that there will probably be many, many more vulnerable people as time goes on, in addition to many more heat events. Let's talk about some other issues relating to heat. In many areas, not everywhere, vector-borne diseases increase in relationship to temperatures. Ticks, for example, are increasingly a problem in the Northeast and Eastern Canada and North America. They carry a number of things, but Lyme disease is one of the most prominent, and actually just today or yesterday in the New Yorker came out quite a long essay on the great increase in Lyme disease. It's believed also to have much to do with how the forests are being broken up in the area so that wild animals are moving around into human areas more, and humans are moving out into wild areas more. So there's more human-deer contact and human mouse or rodent contact. And both rodents and deer carry these ticks and Lyme disease. Hantavirus is there was a story about this in Yosemite a couple of years ago, but the health department in Maricopa County in Phoenix, or surrounding Phoenix, is reporting hantavirus increase also related to an increase in the rodents that carry it. Mosquitoes, of course, carry a variety of very serious diseases, such that in some public health books, the mosquito gets labeled as the world's most dangerous animal. And indeed, as heat gets higher, and especially damp heat with heavy rains and so on, or floods, mosquitoes are spreading northward in the northern hemisphere and southward in the southern hemisphere, or poleward would be a good way to put it. And they're also moving higher in elevation, as are many of these diseases around the world. Eventually it gets too hot for the malaria mosquito, but by then it's much too hot for us as well. Some people have argued that climate change might assist agriculture, and it could be plausibly argued that since carbon dioxide is one of the sources of energy for plants, that plants would thrive more, and you can see leafier developments in some areas, but most crops are not leaf crops. That's not the part of the crop that we eat. And also the rate limiting step on growth in agriculture usually has to do with water. Moreover, there are a number of serious kinds of things going on here that don't get considered in this scenario, and I'll just mention a few of them. First, by and large, agricultural crops and practices, machinery, and human skills have been, because of the relative stability of environment over tens of thousands of years, well adapted to the area in which these crops are raised. And once the environment changes, even if purportedly for the better, the change itself will be maladaptive for the plants that have been developed in the area. I think an interesting dilemma is that of Native Americans in the U.S. who are in a way trapped on reservations, often in dry areas of the country, who would like to grow heirloom plants and those that reflect Native American traditions. But as the climate changes in their own region, they need to seek out genetic stocks of plants that are grown many hundreds of miles to thousands of miles south of where they live. One of the CEOs of one of the oil companies suggested that, well, if things get hotter, too bad, people will just move north. But a couple problems about that. One is, of course, the huge dislocation involved, but the other is that as you go north, there's less and less land area up to the north. Moving everybody from the tropics up to Canada is not a feasible scenario. And then there's not much topsoil up there either, so you can imagine thousands upon thousands of trucks carrying topsoil up to Canada and so on. So there's a certain fantasy level at which people who don't recognize the seriousness of this problem are not dealing with the agricultural problems. So the impacts on agriculture tend to be negative, and I think for each degree of warming, there's a rough estimate of about a 10% decrease in crop yields in many areas, and of course that's just an estimate. By the way, Barb mentioned that I've been involved with a local urban gardening project, which was started in part with concern about climate change. One of the big challenges for that garden is August When we started that garden, you could get up and work in the cool in the morning to tend your plants, but these days, even in Omaha, it tends to stay hot at night, and so there's really hardly any part of the day in August where you can work comfortably outside. And we worry, too, that as water demands become more in season, that cities may refuse or restrict the water use for gardens and not really permit it.
Andrew,
So,
about 5 minutes left.
5 minutes left for the talk?
For your section.
For my section? All right. I'm not sure quite where I am in this, but we'll just speed right along. Wildfires, of course, are a problem, and you're hearing about them plenty in California and Colorado. And in addition to the damage to homes and the risks to people and wildlife, they also pollute the air quite severely, and there are all kinds of organic things you don't want to inhale that are spread by them. There are mental health effects. People tend to drink more and abuse substances to cope with heat. All forms of physical abuse, homicide, and violence increase as the temperature becomes hotter. And I think these are sort of traditional issues that are being measured that people were familiar with. All kinds of people are vulnerable: elderly, all kinds of medical conditions. If you take certain kinds of medications, you're more at risk. Immobility or isolation, mental illness, poverty, and don't forget obesity. As more and more people are becoming obese, they also are becoming more vulnerable. Now, there's lots that can be done and should be done. What we're doing here is we're working with the local health department to promote a heat emergency plan. Omaha's never really needed one until now, and we would like to be prepared. The Salvation Army supplies some cooling centers and advertises them, but that's entirely voluntary. There's no citywide plan that can put some oomph behind the plan to make sure people are alerted, that people are buddied up, that there are social networks that support people, people have contacts with people with transportation, and know where to go. And there are many kinds of spots or places that could be refuge places or cooling centers, from churches to senior centers to libraries to city offices and so on. Meanwhile, there's a lot one can do to redesign cities, like preparing more reflective surfaces on roofs. There are green roofs. There are a number of hospitals that are planting plants on their roofs as a way of providing cooling. And I know Chicago's had a big commitment to green roofs. So there's a lot of different kinds of things, and they need promotion from people with authority. So if you do have a medical voice, this is a good place to exercise it, because there's good return on investment. There's very clearly a problem. There are kinds of things that are not so hard to do that can be done. And you want to be educating patients about appropriate clothing, taking cool showers and baths, what to drink and not to drink, eating lightly, not a bad one, using the old Southern method of keeping your place cool by closing up in the day, venting out in the morning or at night, knowing someone with a car, and those kinds of things. And one should know when one needs to sit down, retreat, or even go to the doctor. Meanwhile, none of this is going to get any better unless we mitigate the problem. All this is adaptation. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we have to move to alternate sources of power, solar and wind in particular, if we are to reduce the use of fossil fuels. And we'll need an aggressive program, since fossil fuels will continue to be valuable even if we build alternatives, to find ways to cut down on their use fairly rapidly. So I think physicians can, and others in healthcare and public health, can do much to play a role in combating climate change. Certainly where you are or we are, we can work toward energy efficiency. We're working on that here at my hospital and medical center. Educate patients and educate each other. I've been trying for a while to get some effective climate change related health education into the medical, nursing, and pharmacy and public health programs here, and that's going somewhat slowly, universities being what they are. Certainly all kinds of education for patients and others is helpful, including in particular city officials, public health department people who are used to sort of what they expect from the past and probably are not expecting the rapidity with which we are likely to see changes. So, deadliest extreme weather event to strike the U.S. Well, by and large, year in and year out, it's extreme heat events that cause the most problems or the greatest death rate. The urban heat island phenomenon increases temperatures in cities during daytime and nighttime. Absolutely true, and often nighttime more than daytime. The rough estimate after careful analysis some years later and reviewing the literature on the rate, the deaths in the 2003 heat wave was about 70,000. The IPCC expects the heat waves to, of course, become more frequent, larger, more widespread, more extreme, and more dangerous. Consequences of heat stroke, that's the most serious level. You can die, you can you have severe fever, the convulsions, coma, and one has to be treated both for fever and the failure of body homeostasis. And there are all kinds of guidance you can give to people with regard to staying safe, and we just talked about that, but certainly finding cool places, staying out of the sun, dressing appropriately with reflective clothing, and by the way, for the sun, you want your sunscreen as well. Know somebody with a car if you don't have one, and know where to go, and know how to manage the temperature in your house. For me, at least, as a longtime member of PSR, I do think PSR is one of the most important health organizations in the United States in terms of being active and dealing with the real dangers and being realistic about them. And I think when we got going 50 years ago, our slogan was to prevent what we can't fix. And it turns out with climate change, we can do a little fixing on the way. And I think as we promote adaptation, teach people about the dangers, we can also help people and institutions to help mitigate climate change. So that's my talk on this, and I think at this point I should turn things back over to Barb for a conclusion. Barb, are you there?
Okay, if anyone has any questions right now, you can click the hand icon on your control panel in order to ask a question. Okay, Maureen, go ahead.
Well, I wrote it. I don't know how much you use both of these parts, the oral and the written. But something that strikes me all the time is the fact that we hear these stories about people, particularly in the Middle East, who live with temperatures very routinely above or around 110 degrees. And I just wondered about the issue of acclimation. Will we adjust over time? Does the problem exist for many of us because we have changing climate as opposed to a persistently hot climate? It's one of those issues nobody talks about very much, and I'm just curious what, if anything, anybody else has heard or knows about that process.
Maureen, this is Andy.
Hi.
Can you hear me, Maureen?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I was quickly reviewing some of the literature, and a certain amount of dissatisfaction was expressed about the capacity to adapt. I think most people agree that there is some degree of adaptation, and it takes time, and that the fatality rates of heat waves early in the summer are usually worse per capita than the rates late in the summer. And I think also with all the migration going on in the world, there's a lot we can learn from people who have lived in hotter climates. Interestingly, in Chicago during the heat wave, the Hispanic population escaped much of the damage that more people who had resided in the area longer had, and it was theorized it had much to do with how people were living generally, that is, close together, active on the streets, in mixed business and housing neighborhoods and so on, so that people really did adapt over a period of time, and these ways of life are probably partial solutions that contribute to physiological adaptation as well. But eventually, I think it gets too hot for adaptation. For instance, in Niger, where I was, people didn't ask, how are you? People asked, how is your tiredness? And generally, people were chronically tired and could not function in the afternoons, hardly at all, and so on. And I'm not sure how they're doing in the Mideast. It's a drier heat, and that might be a factor. So there are a number of things going on, but I suspect that during the heat of the day, people are under shelter of some kind or other. We need to ask them.
Thanks.
Okay, are there any other questions right now? Okay, I guess we're going to switch over to Barb's presentation.
Okay. Can you hear me, Julia?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, we normally complete these webinars with a presentation about advocacy, either advocacy skills that we need to apply in moments when we need to make our voices heard, or sometimes it's the moment. And right now, it's one of those moments when the information that we are learning through this webinar, the information that we already had, information from other sources, really needs to be applied. And because this is a moment, as I said at the outset, when we're in a position to respond to President Obama's climate action plan. As I think we all know, President Obama unveiled his plan yesterday for a concrete, comprehensive plan to fight climate change. It has a number of strong points, including some points that we at PSR have been waiting for a really long time. It also has some points that are not so great, but it creates an opportunity for us to make real progress in fighting climate change. The speech was strong, certainly at the rhetorical level. I mean, Obama saying, I refuse to condemn your generation, speaking to the college students at Georgetown University, and future generations to a planet that's beyond fixing. And heaven knows, sometimes the planet does look frighteningly like, you know, can we really pull it back? Scientists tell us that yes, we still can. We have not reached a tipping point that we cannot turn back. It's a moment of potential. It's a moment that we have to take. In President Obama's plan, there were some positive, concrete goals for reducing carbon pollution. First, and perhaps most exciting to us, is that President Obama is directing the EPA to end what he called the limitless dumping of carbon pollution from coal-fired power plants. He's calling, as part of that, calling on the EPA to establish standards for limits on carbon pollution from existing coal-fired power plants. Now, existing coal-fired power plants are the largest point source of carbon emissions in the United States, so this is really very significant. As I understand it, the EPA will have 1 year from now to develop a rule to limit carbon emissions from new coal-fired power plants, and then we'll make the rule known in a year, and there will be a comment period, typically 60 or 90 days, and then they will review the comments and finalize the rule. So we expect to see a new rule presented in 2 years. That, roughly speaking, outlines the window of opportunity that we have to do a lot of public education and a lot of advocacy and raising of the health voice to make sure that this rule, as well as other opportunities, are fully realized. the President also announced goals for increasing clean energy production. He mentioned in passing solar and wind. He was not specific about what he did and didn't consider to be clean energy. More on that later. But he did say that he's issued a directive to the Interior Department to produce more renewable energy on public lands. And he announced that the Defense Department would be generating 3 gigawatts of renewable power on military bases. It's a huge amount, and the Defense Department is actually one of the largest energy users in the country, so we think that's very significant. And he also called on the federal government to source 20% of its electricity from renewable sources over the next 7 years. So those were some of the concrete goals that he laid out. He also talked about improving energy efficiency as a means of reducing carbon pollution and keeping some kind of a brake on climate change. Energy efficiency is the lowest cost and the most immediate way that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In short, we just don't burn the energy. It's a very logical approach, and I'm really glad to see the President holding it up. He also talked about the increased fuel standards for vehicles and the increased energy standards for appliances. So there are a number of areas that we'll be working on in the efficiency field. In short, his speech gave us the sense that we as a nation really may be able to head in the right direction. There were a couple of other promising features that he mentioned. He did talk, as Dr. Jameton did, about the need for adaptation to protect critical sectors of our economy and of our cities, preparing us for those impacts that we cannot avoid and cannot prevent by building smarter, more resilient infrastructure. He also talked about the need to develop some steps that address the international situation. The United States in the past several years actually has been decreasing its carbon emissions. Some of that has been because of the economic downturn. Some of it was because this past winter was a very mild winter. But still, the trend is positive. It's not necessarily being mirrored in other countries for a variety of reasons. He mentioned, the President mentioned a couple of things that can be done in this regard in the public financing for new coal plants overseas, and negotiate a new global treaty to reduce carbon pollution. And this would be one that engaged not just the developed countries, but all the countries. Now, not everything in the President's speech was that positive. We have a number of concerns that I just want to acknowledge. One was his comments about the Keystone XL pipeline. As you probably know, the oil that the Keystone pipeline would be shipping is the most carbon-intensive type of oil on the planet. It poses grave dangers to our water resources, both our surface waters and the vast underground water supplies of our aquifers that once contaminated cannot be cleaned. There's no way where toxic oil can go once it enters an aquifer. And President Obama's statement was a little bit ambiguous or open to interpretation. He said, and I quote, "Our national interest will be served only if this project does not significantly exacerbate the problem of carbon pollution. The net effects of the pipeline's impact on our climate will be absolutely critical to determining whether this project is allowed to go forward." On the one hand, it sounds good. On the other hand, the State Department has already indicated that it may find that the Keystone project is responsible for only negligible amounts of carbon pollution. The President also gave shout-outs to a number of dirty, dangerous energy sources, including nuclear power, domestic oil drilling, and fracking. But at the same time, what we have here is a moment of visibility for concerns about climate change and a sense of momentum towards real positive changes that can be achieved. So this is a time when we really need to act. We need to make sure that the country takes the vital steps that the President is talking about, because they are in no way guaranteed. This is important if we want to protect our health in the short term and if we want to continue living on a bearable planet or even a livable planet. So what we need to do in the next few days and then over the next several years is to make our support for these positions visible and clear. Those of you who are on our webinar last month know that one of the tools for doing this is writing letters to the editor. That's what we'd like to ask you to do now, and the reasons why are simple. It's free, it's easy, and it's effective. The letters page of the newspaper is one of the most widely read pages in the paper. You know, you probably read it, your neighbors probably read it, and so do your elected officials who keep track of what's being covered and how many people are, excuse me, could someone mute themselves if they're not muted? Thank you. So it's an important way to influence public opinion and to demonstrate that we, people across the country, really care passionately about our health and the health of our children and neighbors and the future of our children. So a few quick and easy tips about writing a letter to the editor. Keep it short. 250 words is a good limit. Respond to an article that's in the newspaper and cite the article that you're responding to. If you're a health professional or if you're a member of Physicians for Social Responsibility, say that. It will increase your authority, the authority of your voice. And write it today and send it by email because timeliness counts. We have more detailed advice for you about how to write a letter to the editor. Go to our home page, that's www.psr.org, and look on the right-hand side for the orange Take Action button. Click there. It will take you to an action alert with tips about how to write an effective letter to the editor. So write your letter. That's the first thing you need to do. And then I'd also encourage you to let us know what you thought of tonight's webinar. We've prepared a very brief, rapid 10-question survey that you can take at this SurveyMonkey address. It's www.surveymonkey.com and then /S/ZWM2XND. If I can read it, you can say it, you can write it down. So we'll leave it up on the screen for just a few minutes. And then we simply ask you to plan on signing up for our next webinar. It's the last Wednesday of every month. So we hope to have you join us again on Wednesday, July 31st. Thank you very much, and that ends our webinar.